Dan Rubenstein, welcome back. Welcome back to Chicago, my friend. How are you?
I'm pretty good. It was warmer on the West Coast. It is colder in Chicago. I'm not breaking any news, Ty, but good people, good, strong, friendly people here in the Chicagoland area. Good, strong, friendly people out west in Southern California. So I can't complain. It was good to get some family time. It was good to get some sunshine, good to kick back a little bit and get out of winter for a little while. And it's great to see your face once again, Ty.
It's great to see you. We missed you on the last episode. Pete sends his best. Pete Sampson hopped on with me. We talked some Notre Dame on the last episode. Go back and check that out.
Yeah.
Gave us some great insight into what that journey was like for Notre Dame and Marcus Freeman this past season. We also have an episode coming up next week. I'm not going to give too much away. I did tease a little bit on the one that we dropped on Tuesday. I'm very excited about what the next week has in store. It is something we have been working on for a while now. It looks like it's finally going to come to fruition. So excited about that. Hit follow, hit subscribe so that you don't miss any of those episodes. 2 a week moving forward until further notice. We'll keep you posted if anything changes, but we are full speed ahead here in the college football offseason. If you want to cement your role as a Verballer, as always, you do have the option of going out to verballers.com. That's our Patreon with the ad-free episodes and the bonus content.
Yes.
Discord acts, a whole bunch of other stuff is available to you out there. You can sign up as a free member if you're ever so inclined. We'll throw you a few crumbs throughout the course of the offseason here.
Take a look around.
Just to see what it's all about. But we are still going here as best we can through the college football offseason, which brings me to the topic du jour.
Yes. By the way, Ty, before we get into the topic du jour, real quick,
please.
Something I didn't realize until you mentioned Pete and Notre Dame. You and I are now in an exclusive club of 2-time losers that both Oregon and Notre Dame have lost twice in the national championship in the modern era. And I feel like we could set up some sort of sad fan consultation via Zoom. We're like, look, I know it hurts. Ooh, BetterHelp, but like BETTOR? I don't know. I'm not there yet. But we are uniquely capable. I don't know who else fits into this situation. Obviously, Alabama and Clemson have lost multiple, but they've also won multiple. So I don't feel like that really works. I'm trying to think if there's any other schools specifically.
I mean, look. What you're referring to is something we have talked about lovingly over the years with the Maryland Terrapins. We are elite losers. At least our teams have been.
Well, what did I say? This year was Auburn was an elite loser for the stretch that they had early on in the season, the ways in which they lost Oklahoma, Cal, et cetera, that it was creative, that they were able to give their own fans unique ways to be devastated on Saturday evenings. But yeah, you and I are experienced losers, I would say, and we can walk people through the different stages of getting over that hope and moving forward with your fandom. So that's nice, right?
We can sell Zoom calls to other people who who aspire to be elite losers, as you and I have been.
That's true. We are nothing if not able to look inward, Ty.
Indeed. Well, on that note, speaking of looking inward, let's talk about college football as a whole. Now, there was an article that came out by our friend Ralph Russo. I think Scott Docterman was also in the byline.
Yeah, Heather Dinich wrote about the same thing, the meetings.
Heather Dinich, Ross Dellinger has written about this. It's a popular subject right now in and around college football, and it's this whole idea of the Big Ten and the SEC using their influence to change college football in one way, shape, or form, be it the way that we go about our college football playoff, be it conference championship weeks, be it things just down to revenue sharing, which we don't fully have enacted yet, but is coming very soon. Just a lot out there right now about the Big Ten and the SEC exerting undue influence and trying to reshape this sport somewhat in their image. It's an article.
Undue might be strong, right? They've earned some degree of influence.
Oh, they've earned it.
How they wield it certainly is an open conversation.
Instead of undue, let's say unbalanced.
Sure.
Influence. Notably, this is an article that I believe moved you in a really significant way. And I say that because we have these conversations every week. What are we going to talk about on the show? What do you want to talk about? What's kind of out in college football X or Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever? What are people talking about and what seems to be moving the needle? And this is definitely something that got you going. And I'm curious as to why, and we're going to discuss why and what it all means here on today's episode.
Yeah, why don't we go through the specifics? So the SEC and Big Ten met in New Orleans last week, in the last few days anyway, to discuss common priorities that they may have with regard to scheduling both during the regular season, how many teams could get into the future iteration of an expanded college football playoff, how many teams would be in the playoff, how many automatic qualifying teams would be in the playoff, how the sport, including those two conferences, will be governed as a whole with all of these changes financially and structurally, and what is in the best interest of those two conferences, not necessarily as it relates to the best interest of the quote unquote sport, but as it relates to the broader college football universe. That's what they met to discuss. Nothing was finalized. There were different models that were broached, but it is interesting to see just how many thumbs of theirs can go on the scale.
It is. And reading through all of these articles in preparation for this, it is striking how far-reaching their impact is. And I think, admittedly, I have had the tendency to downplay it, maybe just because I don't want to think too much about it and it's easier. Total avoidance is always a little bit easier than looking something straight in the eye. But it is striking when you go through all these articles how much influence the Big Ten and the SEC are wielding here. And the ramifications of it, I think, are far-reaching. So that's today's episode. Today's episode is talking through what these conferences want, I think, first and foremost. If they get it, what it might look like. What does it mean for the sport as a whole? What doesn't it mean for the sport as a whole? And then, more importantly, I guess, what does it solve? What doesn't it solve? What new problems may be created as a result of some of these proposals and some of these ideas that are being kicked around? I think to start, you did a pretty good job highlighting what the Big Ten and the SEC want, but they have now positioned themselves as the two dominant forces in college football. They are using that influence to try and shape college football in ways that benefit their members.
Yes.
This is not a great surprise. We've been talking about this for a while, but there are a few, I think, specific prongs of that become apparent if you read these articles. The first is that they want greater control over the college football playoff structure. They obviously want to find whatever way possible to get a larger slice of that revenue pie. We can get into that. They want to, I guess, or are exploring how they can set up almost a separate governing body that I guess the most cynical among us could say would favor their interest. I don't know if that's the intention of this, but look, we're all friends here. We can say it. I understand why people would be skeptical of that.
Right. Yeah, if you're creating your own governing body, hard to imagine that they're going to go against your structural wishes in how they govern the sport.
One could jump to that conclusion.
Yeah.
It was something that came to mind right away for me when I'm reading this. Like, oh, that's set up your own NCAA. Interesting. That's helpful.
I liked there was a comment about a new governing body as created by the Power Four conferences, the quote unquote Power Four conferences. We're Mountain West respecters here. That they're like, we will decide on what's appropriate with regard to revenue sharing and what the NIL marketplace should look like. What's a reasonable third party rate? I don't want to use the word collusion here, Ty, but if you looked up the word collusion, it might align with some of the statements being thrown out there. That like, no, we'll decide what the market is. Like, is that how markets work? Okay,
right,
interesting.
Right. I mentioned the playoff earlier. Two other things that I jotted down on my note sheet.
Yeah.
It's perhaps not a mutually exclusive point with respect to the playoff, but it is the most well-known, and I do think it is separate from what I mentioned before about the CFP structure. Simply put, they want more access to their teams. Both the Big Ten and the SEC are pushing for, a 14. Tony Petitti joked about a 16-team playoff, but they're both.
Why not go 16?
Why not go 16?
Screw it, we're going 5 blades. Continue. Sorry.
They're both looking for 4 automatic bids per conference.
Yes.
They want to ensure as many of their schools can get in as imaginable.
Uh-huh.
And then on top of it, there is this whole aspect of, well, if we're going to do this with the playoff, if we're going to change the way that we go about this playoff, what do we need to do to facilitate it on the week that we typically would have conference championship games?
Mm-hmm.
Let's rethink how we do championship week. Those are 5 big things that I think are involved in this whole round of discussions, and why perhaps it raised many alarms
Right.
in the college football world.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially, I said thumb on the scale, and with regard to automatic qualifiers, it does feel like this is the intersection of insecurity and greed, maybe, by the SEC and the Big Ten. Like, how could Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey imagine a world in which 4 teams don't make a 14-team playoff from their conferences? They're already in an overwhelming rate. Those 2 conferences are going to get the most teams in the playoff because of just the sheer size of their biggest programs between, Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, Oregon, LSU, Alabama, take your pick, Tennessee, Texas A&M, Texas. Like, well, maybe let's not go that far with Texas A&M. They exclusively go 8-4, but in this new structure, they could get in a more direct way than subjective opinions about rankings. It feels very sterile. It feels very corporate. It feels very like the Yankees are worth the most money, so they got to get 6 guys in the All-Star game. You're just like, right. I don't know, Brett Gardner's good, but like this game used to mean something. All due respect to Brett Gardner, who was a fantasy stalwart for me, very productive. Yep. You didn't think we were going to get a Brett Gardner reference in this show, did you?
I mean, Dan, a runs and stolen bases guy, not so much a power fantasy drafter, but continue.
He's a valuable member of this tapestry of winning.
Led the league in total baldness.
There you go. No, there is something very sterile and corporate about mandating where this all goes. I think that is the Champions League like this, where like the biggest leagues get X number of teams each, and then maybe the Scottish League gets 2, and the Greek League gets 1, and the Swedish League gets 1, but also that might be like a play-in tournament beforehand. Every sport is different, but it's something like that, right?
Sure.
That specific leagues earn a certain number of automatic qualifiers. Am I correct in saying that's it?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Because every other league, it's sort of just by record. They changed the rules about like what a wild card, how many wild cards there are, but it's record. It's just cold hard facts.
Yeah, and by the way, practically speaking,
yeah,
if you were to use this year as a go by, the Big Ten's slate of teams would probably look exactly the same. You'd have Oregon and Ohio State, Penn State, and Indiana.
Yeah.
The real difference, again, if we're just using this year's crop of playoff teams as an example, the SEC would have Alabama in as well, in addition to the other 3 teams that made it in, Georgia, Texas, and Tennessee. That's what it would look like practically speaking. Now, we would also be adding another team, and it's not exactly the same, but, from that standpoint, it feels similar enough. It just seems dirtier, right? It seems dirtier.
It seems dirtier also because some of the anonymous quotes from Big 12 and ACC people are like, we just want a seat at the table. We just want to get an invite. However, we can't. Like, it was very defeatist that like they know this is bad for the sport. They know that, it's not the easiest to find the clear best 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 teams. Like there's no way of cleanly doing that every year. But it was a little bit defeatist where it's just like, we just want to continue to exist. And so if they say we can bring 1, we'll bring 1. If they say we can bring 2, we'll bring 2. And it was very stark about where not only the power is, but how that power was attained. That right now it's just an inventory game with Fox and ESPN.
Right.
And, Tony Petitti angling to have the one of the models would be the top 2 finishers who would in a typical year end up in a conference championship game. They're just in and their season's done after, let's say, 12 games. And then 3 and 6 play and 4 and 5 play for those 2 other automatic qualifying spots.
That's right.
Continue, Ty. I know you.
No,
want
I want to put a pin in that.
Okay.
And I want to come back to it in a little bit. Okay, because where I think we should go next is what it could look like around college football if some of these proposals are enacted.
Right.
And we can start with the playoff because I think the playoff is the thing that people have the most outspoken opinions about. Again, we are talking about a 14, if you believe Tony Petitti. Maybe it was just sort of said in jest, a 16-team playoff. Both of these setups, regardless of it's 14 or 16, would favor the Big Ten and the SEC. The proposed expansion here would pretty much allocate 4 auto bids for each of those 2 conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC. The ACC and the Big 12 would probably get auto bids, but they wouldn't get 4.
Right.
Maybe 2. They would probably go to like a 4-4, 2-2, 1-1-1.
One and an open wild cardy. Yeah.
Some sort of setup like that, which, again, to the point, they want a seat at the table, but they're receiving fewer auto bids. In some cases, these conferences are bigger. The ACC is bigger than both the SEC and the Big Ten, but because they're not deemed as good, they're only going to get 2. That's, I think, only further going to reinforce any sort of imbalance we have right now with respect to like who's being represented in the postseason. The other thing that I didn't see mentioned anywhere, and I'm sure somebody's brought this up by now, but if we are moving to a world in which conferences get to decide who their auto bids are, and there's not an agreed upon series of requirements for, say, the Big Ten naming its 4 schools that are going to get through into this playoff, it's 4 auto bids. Does that not reduce the need for the college football playoff selection committee?
It does. That's not a bad thing.
I don't think it's a bad thing. Like, not all these things I'm talking about are pure evil.
Right.
And I actually think, coming back to the point that I just put a pin in a second ago, changing how we view championship week, changing how conferences view those auto bids, and maybe giving them a little bit more liberty to just determine who they want as their representative. I don't think that's a horrible idea.
No.
The grand scheme of this might not be great, but that aspect of it, I think, would add a little bit of interest and some intrigue down the stretch. Maybe it reduces the need for the selection committee. Maybe they're still picking at-large teams, something of that nature. But on its face, I don't hate that concept of getting creative with how we treat that championship week.
I can't help but laugh at how the need to complicate this sport at every turn is never ending. Where you're just like, you will never, ever find another casual fan if you're like, so it's a conference championship weekend, sort of. Well, what is it? We're like, well, they're playing for the 3 and 4 seed. Cool. How are they doing that? They're doing 3 against 6 and 4 against 5. How are 3, 4, 5, and 6 determined? Glad you asked. Here's a series of 7 tiebreakers you might want to familiarize yourself with.
Right.
And I saw somebody somewhere say something like, how do you explain it to a 3 seed that has already beaten a 6 seed 35-13 that they have to play again just to reinforce that we're number 3, number and it's just everything has to be so complicated at every turn. That, and even this year, right, the subjectivity of the committee was dented a little bit as you're like, all right, here's the top 12. Cool. So we're going to play. You're like, nope, number 9 is actually number 3. What?
Right.
They're not the 3rd best team as you saw them. Yeah, but they won their conference, so they're just going to jump up 6. And so we're going to reward the fact that they won the Mountain West or they won the Big 12, even though after their entire body of work, we've determined they're number 9 and number 11 or whatever. And it's just like, at every turn, you have to make this needlessly complicated. And that seems
That's
like
who we are, though. That's what this sport is. It's always been that way. It's scaffolding on top of scaffolding.
It's scaffolding on top of scaffolding, but it does reek of, we have to do everything for TV inventory at every turn. And whatever happens to the sport happens. Let's get it while the ratings are good. It seems very short-sighted to me. It seems that if you are handing so much weight to these 2 growing conferences, that you're going to turn off people. And it might not be apparent in the ratings next year or the attendance next year. But, there'll be a slow trickle, in my opinion, of if you are a Big 12 team, if you are a team in the American or whatever, you're just like, you're seeing what's going on in the sport. You're seeing how it's crazy imbalanced. And you're saying to yourself, why am I building myself up for disappointment by paying for season tickets, by paying for gear, by donating to the collective, whatever, when I know it's just going to be another 7-5 season, another 8-4 season, that will feel like a failure, even though we went 8-4. That's a good record. And everything is sort of being created to treat 8-4, 9-3 like failure seasons.
Right.
And that you feel like just because South Carolina's in the SEC or Oregon's in the Big Ten or something like that, that their 9-3 should be viewed very similarly to your 9-3 or 10-2 or 11-1 if you happen to go 11-1 in a perceived smaller conference. And it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. Like, when you're told your successes don't matter over and over again, you might stop coming to the table, Ty. You might stop coming to the games. You might find something else to watch, or you might go to a bar and watch it and maybe forget the next week because it's a nice day and you want to go do something else. Like, the impetus, the onus, the motivation to be a super fan of your team or of the sport that doesn't view you as worthwhile specifically because you happen to be a Kansas State fan or a NC State fan or a Washington State fan or whatever kind of fan, I don't think you can count on that customer forever, Ty. I just don't.
Well, it's not just that. If we are speaking to what this might look like, this is the thing that got me going. This is what I sent to you.
Yeah.
Buried in some of these articles is this idea of creating a separate LLC that will handle things like rules enforcement and oversight with respect to specifically revenue sharing.
Yeah.
So there's a big settlement about to be approved. We think it's going to be approved. It's already been sort of pre-approved, dating back towards the end of last year. I think April 7th is the date when this could actually become a formalized agreement. We can talk about the House settlement at some point down the line. But for now, anyway, provided this thing goes through, as many of us expect it will, there is a working group. There is sort of a coalition among the 4 power conferences to set up a separate LLC that will handle things like oversight and managing of revenue sharing.
Yeah.
It'll determine how the money gets paid out. It'll determine if there are any caps on that money. It will handle enforcement, making sure that things go swimmingly. It will notably and most importantly be separate from the NCAA.
Yes.
What the articles specify, and I say articles because in some way, shape, or form, they all get around to saying this.
Mm-hmm.
The NCAA will not cease to exist, but the NCAA will participate more from an academic eligibility standpoint, right?
Okay.
They're going to monitor who's allowed to play. They're not going to monitor what happens if you're playing.
Right.
In effect. They may also have some input into larger sort of institutional wide governance on that level. But with respect to this sport and the revenue sharing within and what the rules are for it, they don't want any part of that. And this continues a trend that we have seen through the NCAA over the years, over the last 30 years now, of them ceding some element of control or wanting to get out of that business because they're afraid of getting sued.
Yeah.
And so instead, you leave it up to the Big Ten and the SEC and these conferences to set something up kind of separately that can handle that. Now, notably, these conferences don't want to create any kind of formalized agreement amongst one another because that could open themselves up to lawsuits, further lawsuits. They don't want to be accused of collusion or any kind of improprieties that could be sued that could overturn some of the rules they put in place. Yeah. I am not a lawyer. I know not fully of what I speak, but to my sort of simple man's ear, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
And so whatever they're doing, whatever organization is going on here is a lot of manila envelopes and dark alleys and trench coats and you name it,
Yeah.
just to try and make this thing kind of come together and seemingly benefit the power conferences. Now, a cynical perspective could be that since the Big Ten and since the SEC have such an outsized impact on everything else going on around the sport, why wouldn't they also have their thumb on that scale too? Whatever LLC they're helping to create, why would they not also have their thumb on that scale to make sure that the governance structure is something that's going to benefit them? If they're bypassing traditional NCAA oversight, if they're creating their alternate governing body, wouldn't it be fair to assume that since it's the case elsewhere, that governing body is disproportionately going to reflect their priorities? Is that not a fair way to look at that? Maybe it's cynical.
I think so.
But is that not a reasonable conclusion to draw based on what else is going on around the sport?
I think it's reasonable. You'll note that in one of the quotes from Greg Sankey was, "We've got a lot of lawyers, so I'm very well aware of what I can and can't say."
That's right.
With regard to controlling enforcement and discussing with other conferences how we're going to approach market value. You'll notice they also didn't say something like, "We look forward to speaking with what we hope will be representatives of the players to come to a conclusion."
Did not see
about
anything like that.
sharing.
Did not see anything like that.
Didn't see that.
No.
I also enjoy that the NCAA is going to be responsible for, what do you say, academic enforcement?
Something like that.
Eligibility. I cannot tell you the last time I heard about any sort of major or mediocre player being ruled ineligible after the fall term before the postseason. They're like, in what universe, if Will Howard or Jeremiah Smith or Quinn Ewers or any of these guys ahead of the playoff is like, well, has a 1.7 GPA, won't be playing in the playoff. In what universe will that ever happen ever again?
No.
That some kid fully neglected his classwork and like, well, this player is not playing. I mean, the last time I heard about it, I guess on a major scale, may have been Everett Golson with Notre Dame.
You're going back to 2012.
That was like an alleged cheating situation or something. And he ended up leaving. But outside of that, I don't know what the NCAA is doing, because it appears that everybody's academics are in order.
Yeah, everybody's cool.
Good
Everything's honky-dory. Don't worry about it. We're good.
And if there's some sort of eligibility question about years played, whether you're from a JC or whether it was a COVID year or something, you just sue and get your way.
You sue and get your way.
So,
and I'll say this. I mean,
yeah.
Look, they need to have some bit of oversight. And
agree.
As you know, anybody who follows this knows, the conversation around naming a commissioner in college football has heated up as of late. There is no structure right now that I think would permit that. But at least as a thought experiment, it's not just ours. You can, like, sample any number of college football shows out there, and we're all kind of talking about the same thing right now because it feels like it's headed in that direction. If they do establish some sort of separate but equal entity that handles governance on this level, that gets us closer to a commissioner. It also gets us closer, I think, to splitting off entirely from the NCAA. Creating that,
sure.
I don't want to call it a super league. I don't think it would be a super league, but creating something like that, that eventually the powers that be look at the NCAA, look at the current structure, and they say, we don't need this. What's the point of any of this? Like, we could run it better on our own. We don't need the NCAA. We don't need colleges to tell us what to do, right? The colleges can sort of enjoy the revenue from it and they can have some input, but we can create our own thing and be just as well.
I don't know. I know who this is for. I don't know who this is for outside of conferences that signed away their power to the TV network.
It's not for the group of five. The TV network. I can tell you that. It's certainly not for the group of five.
It's not for the Big 12 ACC. No. It's not for like many fans. I can't even think of that many like Big 10 and SEC fans who are like, oh, this is the move.
Yeah.
This is the move. We need to only have 35, 42 teams or whatever. We need to consolidate power as much as we can because Michigan State it's just more valuable than Oklahoma State or something. Yeah. That like we need to cut off 70% of the teams, 60% of the teams, so that I don't make any more money, but my school that already has an $850 million endowment or whatever, which obviously endowments have nothing to do with college sports, generally speaking, but this very wealthy entity that I'm aligned with for some reason can maximize its earning potential. Right. And so I don't think this is like, people may understand why it's heading in that direction. You're like, this is how business works. I don't know of anybody that actually truly is like, this is the way forward for this sport. That anybody fell in love with this sport and is attracted to this sport because of the earning potential of Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey and their member conferences, and that so many more people want to watch Florida football and Ohio State football. And so it's only right that this sport give them more money because they've earned it in some way.
Look, I give our audience a lot of credit.
Yeah.
Our audience understands why, to your point. They understand why this is happening. It's about money. We don't need to be cynical. We're not even being cynical. We're being realistic. This is about money. Yeah. Everybody understands that. But the closer we get now to turning this into a business, the more I think we're going to turn people off. We've heard it among some of our own people. Some people who have taken a year or two off from college football, they've come back to the Discord to pop their head in. They've said they don't enjoy it as much as they used to. Now, I'm not going there fully with this conversation, but I do think the more you veer into that business side of it, where we're talking about earnings potential, where you see this a lot with ratings too. People who beat the drum of, wow, look at the ratings for the. That's not how most fans think about college football or really any sport. We don't give a damn about the ratings. Give a damn about our team. Give a damn about who wins, who loses, what the interesting storylines are. That was the whole catalyst for starting this show in the beginning. It wasn't which shows or wasn't which games are showing the most rating potential or which teams or conferences are showing the most revenue potential. By and large, fans don't give a damn about that. Schools, commissioners, conference leaders may, but the more we start talking about things like that, I think the more it detracts from the sport that's out there, which, the on-field product I still think is in a great place. We did a whole episode on what needs to be fixed in order to make it better.
Sure.
But beyond that, if you get past this whole conversation, I still just like watching football, and I think most people are in the similar camp.
Yeah, and I mean, look, it seems in retrospect inevitable that when you open up the sport to a finite number of playoff spots with no clear path to being, now you have a clear path by winning a conference and being one of the 5 highest ranked conference winners, but no clear path in a 4-team, because you can just not even play for your conference championship and end up in a 4-team playoff, as we saw with Alabama, or that there's no clear path to be one of those 7 at-large teams beyond just a committee, a collection of committee members has all agreed that you're, somewhere between number 7 and number 10 or something like that. And so you get in.
Right.
So there's no clear path. It does kind of feel like the Ty Hildenbrandts of the world who stood on the table for this expanded playoff are getting what they want, right?
I wanted an expanded playoff.
Yeah.
I did. And I still stand by the fact that it was always dumb to have 4. And so I'm cool with 12. I'm not as cool with 14.
Okay.
I kind of think the 12-team setup's a pretty good one. But once you start getting into 14, once you start changing the parameters by which teams qualify for it, and especially now when you've got what amounts to politics at play, not politics, but politics within the sport at play, that's when it starts to feel a little bit murky. And that's when I start to wonder, what does this all mean? What does this mean for the longevity of the sport, right? We have been talking now, we have been musing over this divide between the haves and the have-nots, really since the beginning of this show. That's what makes college football tick. Yeah. But more recently, because of conference realignment, because of these huge media contracts that both the Big Ten and the SEC have gotten, because of conversations like this, it does feel like there is a widening gap between the Big Ten and the SEC and the rest of the sport. And
it doesn't just feel there is. There just is.
Well, there is, but it feels like it is accelerating, is my point.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about playoff structure and the governance model, if we're basically talking about institutionalizing this power gap between the two conferences with all the money and the rest of them, that feels a little bit murky. I shouldn't have to tell this audience that if something like that goes into effect in a more drastic way, we're starting to talk about even more increased disparities on the financial level.
Of course.
I mean, that's what this whole thing's about. But if revenue distribution is at all skewed towards the largest conferences, what's that going to do for G5 or even ACC or Big 12? It's going to make it harder to compete. They're going to have a smaller slice of that pie. It's going to make it harder to compete. What's it going to mean if the role of the NCAA is further diminished? Does that have any real significance for us? I don't know if I'm smart enough to know that for sure, but it seems meaningful that conferences feel powerful enough on their own, notably the Big Ten and the SEC, to set up their own deal. That seems murky. That seems murky. If all of this stuff is coming as a result of conference realignment and the expanded playoff, then perhaps I need to rethink a little bit what the expanded playoff means to me. On its face, what it means is, again, as I've said for years now, we're not arguing over who's number 4. We're arguing over who's number 12. I support that. I like that. But if, as a result, now we're talking about greater...
Well, as a result, you could be talking about, number 17 is automatically number 12 because they're in the Big Ten. Right?
If we're talking about stuff like that, I was not smart enough at the time to see that coming.
Nobody was smart enough to realize...
That, to me, that skis me out.
No, nobody sort of foresaw in any sort of real way that giving the top 4 seeds to conference champions could end up with pretty significant leapfrogging and weird. And this isn't about Oregon playing Ohio State, just like the idea of you get a +6, a +9 point bonus, a rankings bonus for winning your conference, even though through the course of the season, this is where we've determined the rankings to be. It all very much feels like Fox and ESPN realize that there is a finite amount of time that college football is going to have this level of attention, ratings, value. And so they feel like the best thing for their inventory is to create as many, obviously, helmet games as possible, to create as many Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, Oregon, Texas, Alabama type games as possible, that they need to wring the money out of this rag as thoroughly as possible because it might not always be there. It's really hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube, and I think they realize that as well. But whether it was realignment, whether it was expansion, whether it was all sorts of rulings about TV, whether it was NIL and portal stuff, there have been such dramatic changes to the sport that they realize nothing can move backwards. So while the getting's good, this is how we're going to most efficiently get.
The endless pursuit of more.
Right. It's the endless pursuit of more, but it's also this idea of at some point, somebody said, okay, we know the main thing is this regional tapestry, that there is so much woven into the Southeast, the East Coast, the Midwest, and even though Michigan rates higher than Purdue, it's good to have Purdue around because regionally they make sense, because they're a big school, because there is something that is good about having huge schools, big schools, medium-sized schools that have history together, and that there is that shared bond of teams coming together. And it eventually became like a collection of teams negotiating TV deals together and what have you, and that all makes sense too. But at some point, TV network said, we hear you about the main thing, but we want to create the biggest possible thing for us. And it might not last forever, but if it lasts for a while, that's really good for us. And if college football suffers, college football suffers. But at the end of the day, we're here for Wegovy. At the end of the day. And so that's what makes like even watching ESPN content and Fox content that much more interesting, because people are more aware than ever about where the power lies, and that people pick on Kirk Herbstreit because he doesn't have a great argument, genuine as he may be in his own mind. He doesn't have a great argument about ESPN and the SEC and Disney, nor does anybody on Fox about the Big Ten. Fox was in the negotiating room with the Big Ten when the Big Ten met with other networks. And that is kind of fascinating, that people are so much more informed about the gears and pulleys behind the financial scenes that they're starting to turn on those in power.
But what does that mean? Practically speaking, what does that mean? If this were an elected body.
Yeah.
If this were an elected Democratic body, in theory, you could say, well, you
vote them out. Yeah.
Vote them out, right? This doesn't work like that.
Well,
the people that are voting in Greg Sankey like Greg Sankey.
Yeah.
The people that voted in Tony Petitti, they like Tony Petitti.
Sure.
And that's a very, very small segment of university presidents, administrators, power brokers in this world that are happy to accept more money if they can.
Well, in the short term,
what influence do we have other than saying we're not watching, which is sort of cutting off our nose to spite our faces?
Right.
What levers do we really have to pull?
Well, look, if you're a Penn State fan, you're like, I haven't watched game day in years. ESPN is in the tank for the SEC. ESPN is in the tank for who is on their network, whatever. So I've stopped watching game day. Now, what does ESPN do to get those eyeballs back?
Well, they're going to add a fifth hour. That's what they're going to do.
They're going to add a fifth hour. They're going to go 14 straight hours. Yeah. No, they're going to try to do the college basketball thing and have a Big Ten SEC challenge so that you have to watch the SEC because Penn State's going to be playing against Florida or South Carolina or whoever, because they want to leverage that interest in that you have interest in a Big Ten team or you have interest in an SEC team, whatever, and you hate that the Big Ten did this or you hate that the SEC team did that. So now if you're a Big Ten fan, you're celebrating that the SEC was knocked down a few pegs this past year and South Carolina lost to Illinois and Alabama, who should have been in the playoff, also lost to Michigan to end the year, in addition to Ohio State, right? That like there was this success story of the Big Ten and the Midwest over the South and the SEC that you can celebrate. So you're still involved, right? You're still very much, you're watching the bowl games on ESPN, you're celebrating, you're being vocal about it. So what can you do? You can be burnt out by the whole thing. You can stop watching. You don't have to watch game day. You don't have to watch SEC games. You can pirate a feed of your blessed Penn State game or whatever.
This is your big play. You've talked about this one before. Find a pirated
Go to
feed
sports
somewhere.
bars. I don't know. Where, your stream won't be seen. There's not much you can do. Honestly, there's not much you can do beyond not watching, not donating. You hit him where it hurts if you're really upset by this whole thing. But unfortunately, if you're a fan of a team in the Big Ten or the SEC, people are going to watch.
People are going to watch.
It's the people who are rooting for Cal. It's the people who are rooting for Syracuse. It's the people who are rooting for Tulsa, whatever, that they're going to feel left behind. And while they may watch their team, when their team season is over, like it's on to the NBA, it's on to the NFL, whatever. You're just like, Cal's not playing, Nevada's not playing, Minnesota's not playing. I guess Minnesota's in one of those conferences. You're just like, I'm on to worrying about if the Twins are going to sign Joe Mauer's son or something. Like you're just on to.
Does Joe Mauer have a son?
I assume so. I don't know. And Joe Mauer's son or daughter, whoever, is definitely going to play major Minnesota sports. We know this,
of course.
But you're just going to move on. Like your season is going to be over, and it's going to be tough to it's tougher to be a national college football fan if your team is left behind.
It is. And I would agree with that. By the way, you bring up the Big Ten SEC college basketball-ish scheduling arrangement.
Early season. Yeah.
They are talking about doing something like that.
Yeah.
That's another one of the items that we didn't even bring up because there's so much else here, so much other meat on this bone. But that is one of the other items that's being discussed set up some sort of, as they've put it, scheduling arrangement to get the Big Ten and the SEC playing on some annual basis. I don't know exactly what that would look like. There'd be better games to watch in the early part of the season.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see how those losses factor in down the stretch. If you've got a team with 4 losses, but one's to the Big Ten, the other 3 are to SEC teams, how do conferences or how does somebody determine who gets through into the expanded playoff field? I don't know. But I think on the surface, we'd get some higher level games earlier in the season, which, again, to your point, would definitely provoke emotion and would make some ratings pop, at least in the earlier part of the season when people tend to care the most about what's going on in the regular season. Let me shift this a little bit if I can, as we sort of round the bend on this episode. Let's talk about what this doesn't mean, what these proposals don't mean for college football, right? We've talked a lot about, over the last 40 minutes or so, what it could mean, and in the short term, what it does mean for college football. What doesn't any of this do for college football? What doesn't it mean?
Well, it doesn't make it any more national in terms of conferences. Even though we have conferences that are more wide-ranging geographically, we're still going to have Stanford traveling to NC State, that there is not a West Coast presence to this sport. That the idea that there's a Midwestern presence or a Southern presence, Southern maybe to a lesser extent, but the idea that there's a Midwestern conference fully changes even more with realignment. What doesn't it mean?
I mean, it doesn't, I tell you this, and we've alluded to it a couple times now, it doesn't mean that the Super League is happening yet, right?
Correct.
I know that's a fear. I understand that fear. Maybe this gets us closer to it, but we're not the full way there yet. It doesn't mean that the ACC and the Big 12 are being left out of the playoff. If anything, it could mean that more of those teams get in than at present. Again, I'm saying this sort of with my fingers and toes crossed. I know that I'm taking some liberties here, but it could mean that you've got 2 from each that get in. It could mean more, depending on how they handle at-large teams and things of that nature. So you're not necessarily restricting their access to the playoff. You're just widening that pathway for teams from the Big Ten and the SEC. The good
it doesn't
news,
mean, continue.
I was going to say the good news with this, I guess, is that it's one of the first conversations we've had in a while about this more business version of college football that is not in direct assault of traditional rivalries.
Right.
I feel like every argument that we have made, or every argument that others have made as we've had the conference realignment discussion over the years, all of that stuff has had traditional rivalries in the crosshairs. This at least doesn't seem to do that on the surface, at least not yet. So I guess that's good. And the other thing this doesn't do, it doesn't fully kill the NCAA. We've talked about this. It does put the NCAA's role in a much more diminished state.
Yeah.
So the NCAA isn't going away, at least not yet, but the NCAA is definitely not going to have the same level of sway with respect to college football.
Interestingly enough, it doesn't mean that the Big 12 and ACC are going away. And in some ways, guaranteeing that second spot would have helped the Big 12 this year.
Yeah, I agree.
And the ACC, say what Miami lost to Georgia Tech late. The ACC was very close to not having 2 teams in. And so it actually does potentially help the job security of Big 12 and ACC teams, that you're likelier in some years, with everything being weighted towards the Big 10 and SEC, but still getting 2 in. That helps get more, obviously, the numbers say that probably helps more Big 12 and ACC teams in, but also Big 12 and ACC coaches who don't get in can, I think, pretty truthfully say, the system slanted against us. We had a great 9-3 season. We didn't have any bad losses. We upset Team A and Team B. And there's almost like this idea of, if you're a successful coach in the Big 12 and ACC and you have a good but not great season, that maybe you're going to stick around a little bit more because the system is so skewed against you that you have an argument to be made that, it's just the system working against you, not that you're a mediocre coach. Whereas if you're James Franklin, if you're Dan Lanning, if you're Kalen DeBoer, if you are Kirby Smart, whatever, and you don't make the playoff with guaranteed 4 spots, that's an even bigger failure. That can even heat up your seat even more. Like,
I think that's
you
true.
were given 4. All you had to do was finish in the top 4. And you couldn't finish in the top 4? And what are we paying for this roster? What are we paying for all these transfers? What is your assistant pool? So that weighs perhaps a little bit heavier on the coaches of those huge programs who, don't cry for them. They're already so much more advantaged. But that's an interesting wrinkle, potentially. What does it not mean?
I mean, I'll tell you this. It doesn't mean that the effort of SMU or Cal or Stanford is in jest. I mean,
no.
The SMU play to get into the ACC, paying its own way for the first, 7 years, not taking a payout?
At least, yeah.
Suddenly that decision looks pretty smart.
Yeah, but it also doesn't mean the ACC is safe, even though it is for the short term.
It doesn't mean it's safe. No, it doesn't mean that.
Underscores how much better it is to be in the Big Ten and SEC for teams like Florida State, North Carolina, Clemson, maybe to a lesser extent Miami. Like, those schools are still going to angle. Every Big 12 school is still going to angle. All those West Coast teams are still going to angle if they were in the ACC. Like that. Like, is there hope for at some point Stanford and Cal getting into the Big Ten if the Big Ten is looking to expand its West Coast footprint or something? That it doesn't mean that we are locked on these conferences at all, because everybody is still going to vie for Big Ten and SEC association.
The whole purpose of this is obviously to, shade things in favor of the Big Ten and the SEC. Why don't we close out this conversation by talking about what some of these proposals solve versus which are solutions that don't have a problem?
Right. It solves the idea of like, well, how can these networks make more money? How can these networks cover for some shortfalls elsewhere in their corporate universes?
So let me put it to you this way. The reason I bring this up, it may seem a bit ridiculous to even close this conversation out by talking about what this solves. But the reason that we talk about this now is because when some of this stuff goes through, these are going to be the talking points. If you put Greg Sankey on the Paul Feinbaum show, these are some of the talking points. These are some of the things that you're going to hear Tony Petitti say in the Big Ten Network. Right? These are the reasons why they're doing this. They're going to talk about stabilizing playoff expansion. Right? We've got a structure. We've got parameters. We know how many teams are going to be in this thing for the foreseeable future. They're going to talk about stuff like that. They're going to talk about on some level, and we probably did not pay enough attention to the financial model, the new financial model that is going to, I think, spring up now as a result of the incoming House settlement. Splitting off this separate entity that will handle oversight of that. I guess that's it. Somebody needs to look over it. But having some entity setting that up, they're going to talk about how it solves the, I guess, confusion or possible confusion around the new financial model. They're going to talk a lot about, I think, how it provides greater access to the playoff, to your point, for everybody, right? Not just the two big conferences, obviously the smaller ones as well. The ACC, the Big 12, the Group of Five, I guess you could lump them in there as well. They will use these things as a reason to put some of these new measures in place.
Right.
Anything else? What else is this?
Look, Greg Sankey will be getting fewer calls from the Alabama offices about we need changes. It's BS that Alabama wasn't in this playoff. Like,
right. It does put some of the onus on the conference. If we do get to a point where the SEC and the Big Ten and the ACC and if they have their own setup for determining who they want their representatives to be, almost I think of this in terms of like a conference basketball tournament. It's not the same, although there have been some references to that. If each conference can kind of decide on its own who it's sending, that's interesting. It does take some of the onus off of that playoff selection committee. It minimizes the selection committee, but putting some of that on individual conferences, I do think is at least an interesting twist that I'm not fully against.
You ready for tinfoil hat time? Okay.
Always.
So we go to the model where, as you mentioned, the conferences send who they want to send and decide whatever competitive structure. 1 and 2 get in, 3 plays 6, 4 plays 5 on conference championship weekend instead of 1 versus 2. And we call it whatever, the play-in round, whatever we're going to call it. The SEC has Georgia against Mizzou, 3 against 6. How's that game going to be officiated, Ty? The Big Ten has Michigan taking on, take your pick, Washington, 4 versus 5.
Yeah.
Who's getting in, Ty? I wonder who's going to be getting weirdly specific procedural penalties.
Can you imagine for one second?
And the officials are employed by... I'm actually...
Can you imagine for 1 second?
Officials have a very difficult job. I'm not putting it on them, but I'm just... it feels sticky.
I want you to come with me. I want you to come with me on this thought experiment for a second, because we have talked at length about how disorienting this college football postseason was this year. How we didn't know what day it was. Everything we do is based around Saturdays. I didn't know what day it was for a month. Pete Sampson said the same thing when I had him on Tuesday. Can you imagine how confusing this will be if each power conference has its own way of figuring out who's going
begging,
through?
Please. I'm begging for the most convoluted possible scenario.
I want to hear from the other college football content creators who listen to this show, some of which have even admitted as much.
How dare you?
I want to hear from those folks what they feel like this will do to their, let's say, early December. What will this do to your anxiety level in early December if everybody has their own system for putting 4 or 2 or...
I mean, everybody had their own tiebreakers, right? This year?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I can't wait. I can't wait that, like, different conferences are going to do different things.
It will
all they're after is casual fans. College football kind of has its, like, super fans of teams and super fans of the sport. They're kind of locked in. The sport is after the people who see, as they're scrolling through their DirecTV or their YouTube TV thing or whatever, that number 3 is playing number 7 and it's Ohio State against Georgia or whoever. And you're like, oh, I know those 2 teams. That seems like a big game. I'm going to watch it. That's all they're after. At the end of the day, playoff ratings come down to that guy or gal.
I watched a video because I suck at the video game. I watched a video of a guy talking through how better to play defense, which I still can't do. And I haven't met anybody who actually can. But he inserted a little quip in his video talking about, I don't watch college football. I'm good at the game and I don't play the game. I don't watch this. This isn't for me. But these are a lot of the same people who are used to watching the NFL, used to playing Madden.
Right.
A lot of the same people who appreciate the fact that the college football game came out a little bit earlier and they could start playing it sooner. The season runs later than ever. It's not fully to spec with the NFL season, but it's gotten a lot closer now with this expanded playoff field. To the point, college football wants more of those people.
Yes, of course.
To watch. Whether the game is helping drive it, whether it's this and convoluted playoff qualification driving it, or just a different playoff system driving it, that's who they're fishing for.
And it is a sport right now that it's more impossible than ever to have a famous player in the sport because of movement around the sport, because you are not going to be as attached to a player on your team, a star player, especially if you have a star player that plays for a non-huge program. They're like, why would you get attached to him? And so it is harder to have household names in this sport with all of the movement and how difficult it is to hold on to quality players, even at pretty good places. It's just difficult. And so it seems like
I think it's harder to keep your famous players. I think you're still going to have the same amount, but it's if you're a Pitt, I'll use Pitt as an example at the time. If you've got a household player on Pitt, it's going to be hard to hold on to that guy.
But even if your Pitt player goes to USC like Jordan Addison, we've said this before, right? Like, he's not fun for a Pitt fan to root for, and he's just a guy for a USC fan to root for. Nobody fell in love with Jordan Addison at USC. He was there for a year. Maybe if you're there for a couple of years, it's different. Like, I don't think people are going to look back in 3-4 years and like, man, Dylan Gabriel was my guy. Like, he was there for 3.5 months, 6 months.
It's very transactional. It's gotten much more transactional.
It's a much more transactional thing, and it's harder to. It's already difficult when a player is likely only going to be a star player for 2 years. Sometimes you'll get like special cases like Jeremiah Smith, who's going to be a full-on star for 3 years. But really, you're getting 2 years, maybe a year and a half, something of star potential in the sport. You turn people off, which I think is stupid, but it does seem to be a thing. You turn people off with NIL stuff and getting paid and the sort of what people perceive to be crazy prices that are happening, crazy contracts, crazy dollar figures associated with these players. And so it is becoming much more like rooting for laundry than it is like, this guy is my guy. He's been here for 4 or 5 years, and I've loved watching him these past few years. That I just think it's going to be more difficult. This isn't, Patrick Mahomes somewhere for 15 years that like you gain this familiarity. Coaches are turned off by this whole thing, right? Coaches are turned off. We see coaches go to the NFL or choose to become coordinators or retire because of all the levers and pulleys involved behind the scenes with the sport. And so if you don't have fame and star power being associated with a major sport, I don't know how you get that casual fan consistently. I don't know.
I'll tell you this: the thing that this doesn't solve, among others.
Okay.
This doesn't solve the question of whether or not this whole system is stable. They might argue that certain aspects of it, as a result of the Big Ten and SEC's growing influence, certain aspects of it are more stable.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't be untrue. But what I don't think we know, and we can only cynically assume at this point, is whether or not this full steer into the Big Ten and the SEC having greater control is going to provide longer term stability, or if it's going to lead quicker to fragmentation, something breaking off and kind of starting anew on like under its own banner. I think that's what a lot of people are fearing. And part of why we decided to do this episode is because I think we fear it too.
Sure.
I just worry that this is flying a little too close to the sun. And it's like a precursor for what's to come, which is the Big Ten and the SEC just sort of splitting off, creating their own thing, and everyone else be damned.
You just can't keep changing it. You need to give people a sense of stability. And if you keep changing the postseason, if the NBA keeps changing the All-Star game, you're just driving people away more and more.
Yeah.
I don't see who this is for in terms who is like in terms of this season. Yes, Indiana was super happy, but they've been around the Big Ten forever. I think Oregon fans, some people love that they're in the Big Ten. It's undoubtedly a bigger stage than the Pac-12 was recently. But I think a lot of Oregon people, even after a 13-0 season, are saying to themselves, maybe this is just me projecting, are saying to themselves, felt weird not to play Washington State, felt weird not to play the Bay Area teams, felt weird that not to play an Arizona team, felt weird not to play Utah, Colorado, whatever, a year after, it had like the Deion Sanders, Dan Lanning, play for clicks, play for wins, whatever. It felt strange. Maybe that was a year one thing. SMU fans are thrilled. SMU fans feel like they're back where they should be after so long and got to the playoff. We're right there, on the doorstep of winning the ACC. But otherwise, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a large swath of college football fans who are just like, bring on more changes. Every single one of them, the sport gets better and better.
Yeah.
I think you'd be hard pressed to find the people who are just like enjoying this current ride at the hands of Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey and Fox and ESPN, like who are really loving this roller coaster that they can't wait for the next tunnel. They can't wait for the next jump scare. They can't wait for the next splash. Like
Right.
it again, I've said this before. I'm not a huge fan of using TV ratings as a guiding light.
Well, I said that before.
I'm not that.
That's
I'm trying my best not to be that guy. Period. Also, pretty shocked a lot of people didn't want to watch Ohio State Notre Dame.
No.
I was like, man, what a coup that you could get these two enormous fan bases, enormous helmet game between Ohio State and Notre Dame. You have, the Ohio State story with losing to Michigan and Ryan Day potentially turning the things around and having maybe the most exciting offensive player in the country in Jeremiah Smith, recognizable names behind like Chip Kelly. Like, this is what you want out of a TV product. And on the other side, you get Notre Dame, and love them or hate them. You got an opinion of them. You want to see them win. You want to see them get killed, whatever. This is great. And maybe you had been sick of the SEC on this stage for so long. Maybe that was you. And then not a lot of people watched. Not a lot of people watched the semis with Texas in it and Penn State in it, comparatively speaking. That it's not trending in the ideal direction for ESPN. That's interesting to me. It's not everything. It's 1 year. It's something interesting to monitor moving forward. That, like, this was all for TV, but fewer people are watching on TV.
No. Well, look, we have done a whole lot of yapping.
Yeah, so we do.
It is what we do. Thank you for coming on this journey with us. We would encourage you to leave us comments, send us emails. Of course, the email for a decade plus has been solidverbal@gmail.com. We still have it. You can still email. We read all of them. Please send us your messages. Let us know your thoughts on this. You can also leave comments out on YouTube. You can do so out on Spotify now. A bunch of other podcasting apps allow you to do just that. We read all of those as well. We respond to as many as we can. And of course, if you have yet to do so, please hit follow, please hit subscribe, so that you don't miss any of the episodes that we have done or have upcoming. If you're ever so inclined to leave us a star rating or a review, that stuff absolutely helps ensure other people that this is a show worth listening to and hearing more from. We would very much appreciate that. Verballers.com, is the Patreon. I try not to sell that too hard, but we've got a great community of college football fans out there, many of whom are very interested in this subject and talk about it a lot. Of course, we welcome the commentary of our Patreon Verballerhood to weigh in, leave us comments, send us messages on Discord, let us know your thoughts on some of these developments now. We'll see where this goes. We'll see if some of these proposals make it through, if all of them make it through.
Yeah.
Truly don't know which way this whole thing's headed, but at least for the time being, we have a plenty of stuff to talk about.
We didn't even talk about Notre Dame beyond the TV ratings and how they fit into all of this and whether they would be eligible as if we get rid of the automatic qualifying conference, the top 4 seeds get a bye, the top 2 seeds get a bye. Is Notre Dame qualify for that if they finish ranked in the top whatever? Like, that becomes a thing that, is Notre Dame going to feel any more pressure if the money keeps going up in the Big Ten, SEC, whatever, if they're going to be courted for like this new college football order? Like, that's definitely a thing.
It's definitely a thing. I mean, we're going to have to see how all that shakes out. Notre Dame was able to negotiate what amounted to a sweetheart deal in this first year of the 12-team expanded era. And my hunch is that they're smart enough to figure out another way to do just that if this thing takes another turn. But in due course, we'll talk about that once we figure out where all this is headed.
Yeah. But what does that mean for Notre Dame's or really anybody's schedule? We didn't mention the 8 or 9 conference game situation.
No, that's another thing. Yep.
I think basically all of the Big Ten played in 10 power conference games, and it was like 9 for the SEC. And so how do you get over that hurdle? And, if the Big Ten and the SEC are aligned, are they going to get on the same page in terms of conference games? And if they add a Big Ten SEC challenge, that's an 11th game or something for a lot of the Big Ten teams. Right. And so that needs to be, from a competitive standpoint, discussed. Here's the other thing, Ty. This is my final thought, because you mentioned you can comment on this show, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify. You can email us at solidverbal@gmail.com. I want to know the weirdest piece of technology you've used to listen to this show. Like a modded washing machine, or I don't know if washing machines have speakers, but something has to play the little jingle, right?
Sure.
That like a modded up Dreamcast or T-Mobile Sidekick that somebody was able to find because they live somewhere overseas and there was some market that was selling old electronics to be like, oh man, I got my hands on this Laserdisc player and that's how I listen to Ty and Dan. I don't know how that technology works out so that you could, but I want to know the weirdest piece of technology that you've at least recently used to listen to this show.
Wow. I wish you had given me a little bit more lead time. I could have pulled up some of the weirdest apps and weirdest places that have listened to this show.
No, I know. But you definitely like sometimes see that like I installed Mac OS on my car. I guess it's CarPlay. But I installed, Android on this old Nintendo. And I appreciate the spirit of those people. And I want to know if anybody has used that older technology or weirder technology as a mode to listen to this nonsense. That's what I want to know, Ty. You always see those mods, right?
On that note, why don't we leave it there? 19 people listened to us on a Garmin within the last month, let's say.
Okay. On their GPS?
I have no idea how you do that. Didn't know they had a speaker. But 19 people listened on that. Got a couple Alexas here. I guess that's not.
I want to send
too far outside the norm.
If you
Google Podcasts, 2 people on Google. I thought they killed Google Podcasts.
Yeah, well.
Go ahead. You were saying.
I want to know if somebody has in the last year. Do you think there has been one person, and if you can prove this is you, I will send you a free Solid Verbal shirt, that has listened to us the way that I used to listen to old pirated Howard Stern episodes, which is downloading this show and burning it onto a CDR. If you have downloaded a show in the last year and can prove that you listened back to it on a CDR, I will send you a shirt.
The computers that they're selling these days don't even offer the CDR
They don't even
drive.
offer. But
you can't even get a burner.
Yeah, I know. You can buy, I'm sure there's like, and I know this to be true because I had to do it in order to digitize one. You have to go to like the corner of Best Buy to find a DVD player.
Yeah.
You have to go to...
The geekiest guy in the Geek Squad does this now.
You have to... Well, first of all, you can't find a young person. If you find a young person in Best Buy, you're like, I'm looking for a DVD player. Hold on. Let me go back. I'm looking for... There's this old machine.
Let's get Donald out of the back.
You're going to have to get a guy from the back who's been on an unusually long lunch break to help you out.
That's right.
I want to know if somebody listened to the show on a CDR. CDRW counts as well. Cassette tape, I'll send you 2 shirts. But yeah, that's how I use like 2007, 6, 5, somewhere in there. I used to download Howard Stern episodes, which were great because they were compressed to be so small. It would be like 84 megabytes for 4.5 hours of audio. It was great. But that's how I used to listen. I want to know. Okay, this has gone on far too long, but I'll send you a shirt.
Dan will send you a shirt. All right. Why don't we leave it there? Again, weigh in. Let us know your thoughts on all of this. We would greatly appreciate your input. For that guy over there, my good friend Dan Rubenstein. For myself, Ty Hildenbrand, thank you as always for bearing with us, for downloading, for listening, for supporting, for helping us along. We will be back next week. You won't want to miss it. For that guy over there, again, Dan Rubenstein. For myself, Ty Hildenbrand. As always, stay solid.
Peace.